There, for the grace of God, go I. I want everybody to actually mull those words over for a few seconds and really think about what it means. I want you to consider imagining a God in your head, figuring out what he wants you to do, and trying to live your life according to that. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, liberal or conservative, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, apostate, or Jew. Whatever you feel about those words right now, by the end of today's program, I hope that you're going to find them exactly as disturbing as I do. So I'm not trying to say that religious people can't do good things in the name of God. They do that all the time. But to paraphrase Steve Weinberg here, Nobel laureate in physics, good people will do good things, bad people will do bad, but it takes religion to make good people do evil. Now, I think that's a little bit too narrow. Any dogmatically held belief is potentially problematic and can make people do bad things. And I'm sure all of us here in the audience can think of examples of good people who sometimes behave badly. Yeah, you know what? There we go. But how many times have you ever gotten so irritated at a kid for doing all the stuff that kids do that you literally took them, threw them to the ground, and put a knife to their throat? Right? Nobody does that. That's not how people behave. So it's very easy, to ask, was Abraham here evil? And it's easy to try to write him off that way. But I think a more useful way to think about this is looking at him as an excessively moralistic person or character. And the real problem was his beliefs. He believed there was a God. He believed this God wanted him to sacrifice his son. And he believed that the highest moral virtue was obedience to God. And what's more, on top of all those things, he had absolute conviction in all of his beliefs. And thus it was very much against his own desires that he put that knife to his son's throat. So where else can God's grace take us? If you're an Aztec, it could take you to the top of a pyramid where you'd have your still beating heart carved out of your chest, your skin flayed, and then your head lopped off for good measure. But as this author points out here, it's important to remember that there's no malice involved in this. The Aztecs did this because they thought it was the highest honor that they could give, was that sacrifice to their God, and it was important for their society. Now, it didn't do much for the victim, of course, but if we're going to try to actually understand what motivates behavior, it's important that we understand that. How about this one? This is a 43-year-old Indian woman who was having nightmares, and her family was having nightmares, and they thought that they were cursed. So they spoke to a traveling holy man in the area that told them to sacrifice a chicken. They did that, didn't improve. So they followed his second round of advice, and the woman had her 2 adult children slice apart a 3-year-old boy and sacrifice his remains to the goddess Kali Ma. So once again, there was nothing malicious about this, but we obviously ended up with terrible consequences. Now, we could keep at this all day. We could go through the burning times, the Inquisition, where women were roasted at the stake, and where heretics were literally split in two from not toting the church orthodoxy. We talk about manifest destiny and its result on Native Americans. Talk about the irony of the first slave ship, the good ship Jesus, to reach the Americas. Talk about the Nazi belt buckles, God with us. We talk about Mother Teresa, whose faith-based love of God led her to embrace poverty and suffering with complete disregard for the actual impoverished and suffering masses. And that does not come by way of Christopher Hitchens twisting anything. Those you can read Mother Teresa's own words. And then we have a whole slate of American theocrats who are looking to tear down Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state in an effort to return us to a time that never existed except in their minds. So those are some of the places that God's grace has brought us in the past. And today we're going to focus on one specific set of ideological principles and one group of very motivated religionists that have been in the news since 9/11 and before then for just reigning terror across the world. Our challenge today is to try to steer a course between the bigotry and xenophobia that we've seen on the radical right, and the kind of refusal to acknowledge reality that we've seen on the far left. And our goal is simple, it's to have an honest conversation about a complicated subject that has profound ramifications for all of us. So with that as an introduction, I'd like to have the speakers come on up to the stage. You guys can just pull the chairs up. Munaza Anis is a radiologist at McGuire VA Center. Also, maybe you can sit there, and she's going to be moderating with me today. Yeah. She and her husband Jason and their daughter Maya moved to Richmond over the last year. They established their secular bona fides by getting married by Herb Silverman, who's the president of the Secular Coalition of America. Munaz also happens to be an ex-Muslim herself, so thank you for all the help in setting the program up, and she's going to be an important part of the conversation. Next, I just go to, some of you will recognize Dr. Andy Thompson from a couple months ago when he came here and spoke about why we believe in gods. Andy is a forensic psychiatrist and has an adult practice, also takes care of students at UVA. He's the author of Why We Believe in Gods. He also has an expertise in both evolutionary psychology and in religiously motivated suicide terrorism. Peter Boghossian. Peter, are you still able to hear us now?
I can hear you. Hi.
Cool. So Peter Boghossian is a philosophy professor at Portland State University. You've seen him on some videos. We've had technical problems with him in the past, so I think hopefully we have worked past those now. He is an expert in moral reasoning and critical thinking. He's done a lot of work in recent time trying to use those skills to help us address Islamism and figure out a way forward. He's also the author of a manual for creating atheists and a new app called Atheos, which helps people, non-believers, speak to believers in a sort of humane way and make some progress. The last two, we have Mohammed Saeed and Sarah Haider, both co-founders of Ex-Muslims of North America. These are, despite their young age, are extremely courageous, extremely informed. I had the pleasure to interview them probably about 2 years ago, and that was about the most informative show that we had done. So thank you guys all for coming, and let's get underway. All right, we're going to start with this one. If everybody can just take a look at that cartoon. So how many people think this cartoon is just hysterically funny? How many think it's a little bit offensive? How many think it's so offensive that we should literally be killed for showing it? Right, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. That's actually the level that we're at, where people are getting killed for cartoons. And Manaz, maybe you can get us started with that idea.
All right, so first of all, I'm thrilled to be part of this panel, and I'm really honored for you guys doing very important work. So we wanted to start with both Sarah and Mohammed, with you guys, and can you remind us what happened a decade ago when some Danish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad were published? Maybe Mohammed can take that.
So a Danish newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, had a competition for drawing cartoons about Muhammad. When the cartoons were published, the local Muslim community was outraged. And in particular, there was a group of imams that were outraged, and they tried to create a backlash, but the Danish community of Muslims weren't receptive to that. They started traveling internationally, went to Egypt, went to a number of Muslim countries where they tried to basically stoke backlash. They said that mosques weren't allowed in Denmark. The Prime Minister of Denmark was against Muslims. He was from the same party as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and they used that to sort of incite people. They actually drew extra cartoons in order to make people believe that the situation was worse than it was. It took them multiple months to be able to create the backlash they did, but as a result, you had mass protests across the Muslim world. Multiple people died. Danish embassies were attacked, and when the news was covering that, a lot of newspapers around the world refused to cover it because of the fear of that backlash.
And so in the same vein, what about the Charlie Hebdo event last year? Could you just...
It's a continuation of the same thing in the sense that Charlie Hebdo was one of the newspapers that stood with Jyllands-Posten, and they were condemned by the French Prime Minister at that point. And They continued publishing. Most other newspapers had stopped due to fear of the consequences. They, after the Arab Spring in 2011 in Tunisia and multiple other countries, Islamists came into power, and they had an issue came out where they had Muhammad in the issue expressing sorrow for the state of the Muslim world. And as a result of that, their offices were firebombed. And this is in 2011. Then in 2015, last year, two Algerian descent shooters went to their offices and tried to massacre everybody from their staff.
Right. So, Mohammed, what do you think is the theological grounding of these attacks?
So, there are two sides of it. It's often confused. One of the things is that drawing figures and creating idols is regarded as blasphemy, is regarded as the highest sin possible within Islam. But usually that isn't the issue. The issue is that it's regarded as insulting. It's regarded as blasphemy, that you're insulting our greatest, the greatest part of our religion, our prophet. So it's a reaction to that, and it's a reaction to sort of trying to prevent people from ever doing that again.
So blasphemy could be many things. So blasphemy. So saying that there is no God is blasphemy. Insulting Muhammad is blasphemy. So what else could be blasphemy?
Our existence. So
that's right.
as in leaving Islam is not allowed. So the fact that we exist is to a great extent regarded as blasphemy, which is why apostasy is punishable by death. And this goes back to the earliest Islamic history. Right after Muhammad died, a lot of people in Arabia left Islam because they believed that they had allegiance to Muhammad himself. After his passing away, they returned to the original religions, and the caliph that followed Muhammad attacked and killed tens of thousands of people due to apostasy. And those wars are in Islamic history itself referred to as the apostasy wars.
Can I ask for a second? If our microphones cut out, are people able to hear, or are you losing what's being said? Okay. So I think all of us need to be really careful. Sometimes when you turn, the mic cuts out. So we'll try to be careful about that.
So maybe, Sarah, you could tell us about the Yusu Charlie, which was a show of true solidarity that was sort of celebrated or attempted. Do you think that was a show of solidarity, or was it just empty words?
I think it was a show of solidarity. I mean, I take it for what it was, and it was a very beautiful thing, in my opinion. I mean, the way that the attacks went, the way that they happened, and the brutality of it was so shocking. And to see it happen here and so close to home was, I think, something that affected a lot of people. And for the first time, they were confronted with this in such a way. So I thought that coming together in the form of in that show of solidarity was a wonderful thing, and I do take it for what it was. Unfortunately, afterwards, what happened was somewhat of a backlash against that show of solidarity, where people began talking about the content of the cartoons itself and saying that they were bigoted and that they were racist, and especially people that didn't really understand French humor and their history. So there was a lot of misinformation going around, and the conversation shifted from the brutality of the murders and blasphemy and right to criticize and right to offend and right to ridicule to, well, did they have it coming? Which is a very nasty, right, which was nasty.
Yeah, they were asking for it.
Right.
Something like that, yeah. So why didn't media giants like CNN or other media giants publish their cartoons en masse? Why do you think?
I think it was, they were afraid. And in this sense, they got what they wanted. I mean, I know that we shouldn't, a lot of people talk about this, that we can't let them have what they want. But truly, in this sense, it was fear, I think, that prevented a lot of people from publishing those cartoons. And they weren't wrong to be afraid.
Okay. All right, Peter, this one's for you. In the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, Pope Francis noted, one cannot provoke, one cannot insult other people's faith, one cannot make fun of faith. Meanwhile, Glenn Greenwald and a litany of others echoed the sentiment that, sure, violence is always wrong, but the cartoonists got what they'd asked for, kind of just said. What are your thoughts on that? And is there anything that you have to say about the value of free speech versus the right not to be confronted with offensive material?
That's a great question. Let me first start by saying thank you, Rob, for putting this together, and thank the panel. It's been the first time I've spoken to some of you, so it's good to see you in person. Is my audio coming across well?
Yep.
Okay. So it's a big question, and I think it's incumbent upon us every time we hear these claims to think about what is the best argument that one could make on the opposing side, not necessarily for the more egregious instances of murdering people, because I don't think there's any good argument for that. But what is the best argument that one could make for why we should curtail these freedoms? Now, the difference in the United States and Europe is that we have constitutionally protected freedoms. And so every time, like I didn't see the cartoon because I just couldn't see it given the technological setup. But if it was the cartoon of Muhammad with a bomb in his turban, what that really was a political cartoon. And the consequence of that is when you're told that you ought not to print political cartoons, you basically are telling people that they have to give up their right to free speech. And in this country, the highest right of free speech, the most protected right that we have is political expression. So you're asking us not to give up our political expression. I'm not going to comment on Glenn Greenwald's utterly despicable comment. I'll let that comment stand for itself. I do want to think about this in philosophy. We say a hermeneutic of charity. I want to give the most charitable interpretation that I can to this, and possibly see if we can think about this for a second. The claim that I have heard repeatedly is that there's a certain intrinsic or inherent hypocrisy in the West with the Western media and Western standards because, for example, we don't allow cartoons with the N-word or to portray blacks as monkeys or these racist cartoons. And the argument by analogy is just as that is as offensive to us, so too is it offensive to Muslims to see their prophet portrayed in this way. And I think that is a good starting point if we really want to ask ourselves hard questions. For example, Hitchens was very much against Holocaust denial and defended David Irving and others. Holocaust denial laws in Europe, specifically in what Rumsfeld called Old Europe. But I think that's a good place to start the conversation. Is there a double standard in Western media, as many, not even Islamists, but many, even mainstream Muslims claim that there is?
All right, thank you. So, Andy, half a year after the attack, the new editor of Charlie Hebdo announced that they would not be drawing any more cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, and he softened it, saying, because we've already established our right and stuff. What's the purpose of terrorism? Did they achieve their purpose with that? And can you maybe just start laying out some of the important historical and evolutionary underpinnings that will help us understand what we're seeing from ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda?
Sure. First of all, I too would like to thank Rob for putting this together. You haven't seen all the enormous work behind the scenes that he has done. I would also like to thank our guests. I think most people here appreciate the courage that Mohammed and Sarah have in being ex-Muslims and open about it at this time in our history. So thank all of you, and thank you all, the audience, for coming today. I think most people probably remember their history and that the word terrorism comes from the Reign of Terror after the French Revolution, 1793-94, and that was originally state terrorism. And it comes from the French word tourisme, I think, pardon my pronunciation, which means to frighten. The origin of that is actually a Latin, terror, which came about, again, for fear of it was the Cimbri tribe, and they're attacking Rome, I think, in about 105 BC. And so terrorism means to frighten, to induce fear. And the idea of individual terrorists and terrorist acts actually dates to the Russian anarchists at the end of the 19th century, and one particular one whose name I can't remember who described himself as a terrorist. And the the purpose is to generate fear. I think probably few people realize that the age of what is called modern terrorism, suicide terrorism, 1982 into the present. How many of you would guess that only 44,000 people have been killed in suicide terrorism since 1982? 100 and some thousand wounded. Yet it has frightened us all, it has frightened us deeply, and that's the purpose of it. It's not so much the deaths, but the means of the deaths and the fear that it generates. Suicide terrorism has a fascinating history. The ironies are abound. The original suicide terrorists in history were the Jewish zealots, the Jewish Sicarii, named after the long knives that they would use. And they would assassinate Hellenized Jews and Greek and Roman administrators, and this is in the 1st century AD. In a sense, their activities are what provoked and ended at Masada. And they would be killed shortly after assassinating their target, or in the process of it. Fast forward 10 centuries. The next suicide terrorists we have are the Hashashin, and this was in what is today Iran or Persia. And the irony here is that these were Shiite assassins, again, assassinating Sunni administrators and higher-ups and being killed when they did so. And as I think most people realize now, modern suicide terrorism is primarily Sunni on Shia. Fast forward again 10 more centuries, and you get the anarchists at the end of the 19th century. And then scholars then make another division with modern suicide terrorism starting in 1982 with the bombing of the Marine barracks. And I think, again, what most people don't realize is that modern suicide terrorism, that body count of 44,000, the majority are other Muslims. It is Muslims, basically Sunni Muslims killing Shiites. And the actual attacks on civilians are rare. They're usually against security checkpoints, military, mosques, and that just gives you an overview of where we are. And yet, I think all of us, I feel it, it engenders fear in all of us, and that's the intent. And the suicide terrorists do succeed. If you just go back to the Marine barracks, those of you that remember the Marine barracks, what was President Reagan's response? To leave Lebanon. And the suicide terrorists here with Charlie Hebdo I'm sorry, they weren't suicide terrorists. The terrorists with Charlie Hebdo have succeeded. They're stopping publishing the cartoons. But I think it's a more complicated question, particularly in the modern corporate world. If you were the CEO of CNN, yes, you might feel strongly that I'm going to show the cartoons, First Amendment rights, freedom of speech. But then in your job as a CEO, are you going to make a decision that is going to put your staff and your employees at risk? Mm-hmm. I think it's a more complicated question. So if I was the president of Charlie Hebdo or managing editor, I think it's a complicated question. But the bottom line is that terrorism works, and it has worked historically. And I think we'll continue to do so.
So maybe we can come back later and try to touch on some of the evolutionary underpinnings for that. I'd like one of you guys to just pick up on something Andy said about, so the purpose of terrorism is to inspire that fear. Is our media playing a responsible role, or are we doing the exact opposite of what we should do? Sarah, do you want to start answering about the media maybe, or finish that up while we're trying to get Mohammed set?
Sure. Mine is working fine, I think. Well, It's like what Andy was talking about a little earlier, that it is more complicated than just simple, they should, and I think that it's true that they should, but there are very rational reasons for why they don't. You have obligations to your employees, you have an obligation to your family, which is why a lot of ex-Muslims don't speak out, because of that obligation to your family. That prevents people from speaking about this, and it's a rational fear. It's not an irrational fear, but it does turn into a situation where we are controlled. It's very effective. I think that's what makes it a very dangerous thing to talk about and a dangerous line to walk, because you are taking very real risks when you're talking about this issue. But if we do it together, that means that each of us are in a little bit less danger. And this is why I encourage other ex-Muslims to speak out, and that's why with ex-Muslims of North America, we work to highlight the voices of other ex-Muslims, because the more of us that talk about this, the more we normalize criticism of religion at all, the safer each of us are in turn, because it's not so much of a head of a snake type of a thing, it's a groundswell movement.
All right.
Could I add to that, Rob?
Yes, absolutely.
So I think that's absolutely right. I think everyone has to do it together, but I want to punch home Andy's point. I think that these sorts of decisions are far more complicated than one would think, and it's very easy for many to criticize people for not reprinting the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. I was in a very similar situation, and that I'm coming out with an app. You mentioned it, Atheos, for the Richard Dawkins, in conjunction with the Richard Dawkins Foundation, and one of the executive decisions I made was to not include questions about Islam. So basically, the app teaches users how to have conversations with people to help them become more reflective about their beliefs. And I cannot even begin to tell you how much flack I caught about that decision from my team. And the very next day was Charlie Hebdo. And this was a balancing act for me. You know, I had to think about, I have a family, I have kids. I think Sarah's right. These are not imagined threats. These are very real things. So how do we make that balance between our own personal safety, the safety of our employees and our teams, and freedom of speech? I just want to underscore, it's not that easy to say, well, you know, those folks should have published the cartoons, or these people have families, they have employees, they're responsible for people. It's a very complicated situation. And again, Andy is also right in that these techniques have traditionally been very, very effective. And the example of Reagan, I remember that very well, with the Marines was one, the whole paper tiger narrative that went out. So I just think that it's more complicated than people think it is.
And we have this is going to be later, we have a cartoon that David Silverman put in his new book, Fighting God. We'll show it later, but we'll probably skip over that part of the conversation, where he had to go through the same exact thought process. He decided he wanted to publish a cartoon about Muhammad, and basically he couldn't end up doing it because of all the risks it would put himself and everybody else at that had to do with the book. So he had to just put a smiley face and label it literally not Muhammad. So you'll see that later, but it is something that everybody that's remotely involved in this actually has to take it very seriously. And with Atheos, it's really sad, because I imagine, do you think that a lot of Muslims could benefit from Atheos?
Oh, there's no question about it. There's no question about it. And we put in 2 softball questions about Islam. And I want to say one more thing about that I think is important. If somebody levels a criticism about us or about what we're doing, and we don't have the same worldview that those people have, and they're correct, we need to say that those people are correct. We have to end this kind of tribalism that we have. Christians have criticized me, and I think many others on the panel, because I have not been as strident on Islam as I have been on Christianity and other religions, even Scientology, risking lawsuits to myself, I might add. And I think that those criticisms are correct. And there's a reason for that. It's not that I have an intrinsic bias against Islam, but I have a fear, I have a regard for my own safety.
All right, we're going to continue with more cartoons here. How many of you guys have heard of the Jesus and Mo cartoons? So not a lot. I encourage you to look it up. Just look online, Jesus and Mo. If you want to support the person that does it, you can do that. You know, they have some books online. I had permission to use their cartoons as long as they remained anonymous. And you'll note that in the cartoons coming up, I've actually taken Muhammad out because I don't want to put myself at risk, people here at risk, family at risk. And I don't think a lot of people in the United States truly appreciate the risk that these guys take and that this really is a big deal. And I think the left misses that to a large degree. So we're going to show some of it. So this first one, I put it up there. I can't really read well from this angle, but it's dedicated to the ex-Muslims and basically says, can't you guys just move on? And the barmaid says, by move on, do you just mean shut up? And so Sarah and Muhammad, what do you guys do with ex-Muslims of North America? Why don't you just move on and shut up? Is there something important that you guys are trying to accomplish?
Change the world. Essentially, that is why reform hasn't happened in Muslim countries. Over here in the West, you had brave people that stood up for centuries, fighting back against the power of the church, fighting back against the power of the state, demanding change, demanding the right to blaspheme. The right to blaspheme didn't exist in the West. It was people through centuries that pushed back until the consensus within society changed. Within our society, what has happened is when people have stood up, they've invariably been murdered. So until and unless people start standing up and demanding change and sacrificing, things can't change. And somebody needs to do that. So going back to the earlier question, it's about distributing risk. The more people that stand up, the more people that speak up, the harder it is to silence. On the other hand, if there's an act of violence and everybody stops speaking about it, you've already lost. In Pakistan, there's a blasphemy law which is used to often target Christian minorities and other minorities. The governor of the largest state in Pakistan spoke up about that he didn't even criticize the law. He said the law shouldn't apply to minorities. It's a law about Islam, the Islamic prophet. Why are Christians being persecuted? As a result, he was murdered. Nobody spoke up about that. Since then, nobody has stood up for the rights of Christians in Pakistan. The issue is closed. So every time we refuse to stand up, every time we refuse to take a stand, we're losing our liberties when we do that.
Sarah, do you want to talk about some of the things that your organization does?
Well, we focus on building communities in addition to our advocacy. Can you hear me now? Sorry. But we focus on building communities because of how difficult it is for any individual, and this isn't even people who come out of the closet. That's the terminology we use for people who are open about their lack of belief to their family and to their friends. But many people are not. Many people are not open about it, and their families don't know, and their friends don't know, and they feel isolated and alienated from them. Sometimes they do come out, and then there is that gap between themselves and their family. Sometimes they're pushed away from their communities and pushed away from their families. So our focus is on giving them something that they can hold on to, and something that they can call a reliable group of people who they can get in touch with when they need that support and that community. Because it's the isolation, I think, that is the most difficult part of more people not speaking out about this. Not everyone is going to be an activist, not everyone is going to publish Jesus and Mo cartoons, but even if you are just an ex-Muslim or an atheist or a freethinker that comes from a Muslim background, you're going to feel that sense of alienation. And that in itself is something that is very hard for a lot of people. And like with we use a lot of the terms from the gay rights movement, like coming out, because it makes sense. And in addition, when people around you are ex-Muslims, people who you know are atheists, I also think that will change slowly but surely the way that the Muslim community interacts with apostates and how they feel about them and how they deal with them.
So I'd like to add to that. So when we started, we've been around for around 2 years. One of the most commonly heard line that we heard was, "I thought I was the only one." And in the 21st century, for anybody to think they were alone and the only one at anything, to me, is slightly insane. And if you talk to the average Muslim, if you looked up how they spoke about apostasy, the general consensus was it's some sort of conspiracy, it doesn't really exist, it's an attempt to defame Islam. But just within the past 2 years, so many people have started leaving religion that pretty much every single major Islamic conference that has happened in North America has had panels talking about the problem of atheism and how we can tackle our youth being misled. So just within 2 years, you've had this massive movement. So because of that, I am very hopeful.
Can you guys also comment has most of the trouble you've had or criticism come from conservative Muslim community or from the left?
Well, we don't actually interact too closely with conservative Muslims at the moment. We're trying to build our coalition, and we're trying to find support and get our voice heard for what we go through, because a lot of people don't really know about ex-Muslims and don't know many personally and haven't really heard about the struggles that ex-Muslims in particular go through. So at this point, we're educating a lot of people that we believe should be our allies, but sometimes we're finding a lot of difficulty, and it's to what Peter was saying earlier about the risk that any individual takes when they're speaking out about Islam. I'm not asking everyone to stand up and create a Jesus and Mo cartoon. That's not what I'm asking. But at the very least, what we can do is support those who do speak out. And not enough of that is happening, unfortunately. There's a lot of Muslim reformers even, not even atheists, but there's Muslim reformers who get branded as racists and bigots and neocons, even though they're extremely liberal in their politics. And the only thing that people have to hold against them is that they criticize the religion in any way. So I think that is something that each of us can do, and that has been the biggest struggle that I've had, which is trying to convince the left and people, liberals in general, who I thought would be my natural allies, to join me in this criticism.
Actually, it's very difficult, when I was trying to join ex-Muslim, these guys don't advertise themselves, so they have this very rigorous system of Skyping multiple times before they actually accept you. So they're not openly advertising themselves. You really have to seek them out to be part of what they're doing. And that's also for security reasons, which is very obvious. So Andy's book for the audience is up here. He wrote a book, Why We Believe in Gods. We're going to talk about this Jesus and Mo cartoon with Andy. Did you get a chance to look at this cartoon?
I've seen the cartoons, I can't.
Yeah, I know. It really talks about the mind of God. And so the question basically is...
Right, I guess to summarize, it's Jesus and Mo are having their discussion, and they don't want to hear the barmaid's opinion because, that's just her opinion. So they go with God's opinion, and how do they know it? That's because that's my opinion of what God's opinion is. So if you can talk about how they could know the mind of God so well.
Well, we now know how human minds generate religious beliefs. And one of the mechanisms is the everyday mechanism that all of us use. Religious beliefs arise out of everyday mechanisms that we use. And all of us are constantly thinking about what somebody else is thinking. What is Rob thinking about what Muhammad just said? What is Muhammad thinking about what Rob might ask him in a minute? If we stop and think about it, we're constantly thinking about what other people are thinking, believing, desiring, and I might be thinking about what Rob's thinking, but what does Muhammad think about what Rob is thinking, first order, second order. And we take this for granted. But it's really extraordinary cognitive mechanisms that we have. We're an amazing animal, and we've developed these cognitive mechanisms, and they're called mentalizing, or the other name for it is theory of mind, meaning I have a theory about what's going on in somebody else's mind. And what that cartoon is doing is showing that what they're doing, what Jesus and Mo are doing, or they're using the mechanism that they should be using and being more respectful of with the barmaid, what she's thinking. They're using the exact same mechanism to, think about what God might be thinking, wishing, believing, or desiring. And what's, I think, even more exciting is that science has now shown us that when we think about what God is thinking, we're actually projecting what we think. If you are interested in this, there's a beautiful paper by a man named Epley and some other scientists, and it's accessible, E-P-L-E-Y, and and it's a beautiful example of science because it's multiple universities over different countries, and they did this fascinating MRI work in which they manipulated people's beliefs, what people believed they thought God believed, what they thought other people believed, and it's just brilliant science. And what they showed is that when we think about what God is thinking, we're just thinking about our own beliefs. What we think God believes is just a projection of our own beliefs. And these are theory of mind mechanisms, and it's just one example of what we now know, which is religions arise out of everyday, ordinary, but not so ordinary, cognitive mechanisms that we originally evolved for other purposes, but that we're just using all the time.
So I think basically, does it matter what people believe as far as actions? And then also, does it matter what people believe their gods believe?
Yeah, beliefs matter. I mean, people act on their beliefs. But we're told what to believe, and we're told what God tells us we're supposed to believe. But then once we start believing it, we project it back onto God. And if we change our opinion, God's opinion changes. It's increasingly complicated. But the bottom line is beliefs do matter. And also beliefs we now know, again from what I think is fabulous science, we now know that the areas of belief in our brains is the sort of same areas of our brain that our identity, identity formation occurs. So our beliefs are very much tied into our personal identities. And that's reflected in our speech when we say, I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Christian, or I'm a psychiatrist, or I'm a Christian psychiatrist, or Muslim. That actually has grounding literally in our brains.
So are we going to change gears now? So Peter, I think somebody needs to do a study on correlation between jiu-jitsu and atheism. I've come across so many atheists, including yourself, Joe Rogan, Sam Harris, my husband, who are into jiu-jitsu. But so we're changing gears here, and the question I have for you is, what do you think of the notion that we cannot judge other cultures?
I think it's a moral toxin because it prevents us from making discerning moral judgments. And what we've done is we've told, particularly in academia, we've told people that it's important for them to withhold moral judgments about things, and what we should be doing is to teach them how to make better, more discerning moral judgments. Obviously, we can make judgments about people, about people's cultures, cultures in which people come from. And again, the wording is tricky. For example, you can just look at those cultures in which ice skating is, or bobsledding. There's a famous movie about the Jamaican bobsledders. So certain cultures have conditions that enable certain behaviors and activities to thrive, and other cultures don't. We have no problem making judgments about those cultures. So I think it's a problem. And in terms of jiu-jitsu, I don't know why so many atheists do jiu-jitsu. I have no idea. I've speculated that about that in the Joe Rogan podcast. One of my thoughts is that I think that jiu-jitsu it's not a fantasy-based martial art. It's a very realistic, and so it affords people naturally have these proclivities who are atheists to find what's true in general, to find out what's true, and to develop these discerning mechanisms to figure that out. And jiu-jitsu offers a way to test those ideas. That's my guess. I don't know.
I don't want to get too far off track, but I don't know that people will know what you mean by fantasy-based martial arts unless you...
Oh, yeah, I just have a paper under review about that. So it's anytime there's not a resisting opponent. So if you don't have somebody who's trying to choke you out or punch you in the face, and you're just practicing, it's called kata, like make-believe land, then you have no corrective mechanism. You have no way to bring your thoughts into alignment with reality. It's exactly the same thing as prayer or any other superstitious practice, ritualistic practice in which one engages. If there's no way to figure out if that's true, you become increasingly convinced over time that you extend the confidence in your beliefs beyond the warrant of the evidence. And that's most conspicuous in martial arts like Taekwondo or Jeet Kune Do or anything that practices against make-believe opponents. Think about it like this. Think about it like a person who practices playing basketball every day for a year, but without a ball. And they become convinced that that activity has then made them better at basketball. It hasn't made them better at basketball. It means they look pretty cool, maybe a little bit silly, but the ball is the corrective mechanism to bring their cognitions in line with reality. And that's the same thing as the original question with culture. We have corrective mechanisms like, adjusted GDP, infant mortality rates, et cetera, that span any metric one wants to invoke. And because all those metrics are not equal, that by definition means that certain cultures are better or worse in those activities.
All right, so one of my favorite YouTube videos online is Sarah's talk on the AHA one. And I don't know if the audience knows, Sam Harris is called Sarah, my hero. So Sarah, you gave this amazing talk last May titled Islam and the Necessity of Liberal Critique. What was the main theme of your talk and how was it received?
Well, this talk I gave May of last year, and I was asked to give it earlier on in the year, right after Charlie Hebdo, and right after seeing the reaction from some people on the left to the murders, which was not what I expected, and it was actually in some ways more shocking than the actual murders, if I can even say that. It was to me something that I didn't see coming, and it hit me very, very hard. So I thought that this was something that I should talk about, specifically the tendency on the left to this knee-jerk reaction to protect Muslims from bigotry, which is a real bigotry. There is, I think, such a thing as anti-Muslim bigotry, and it's a very specific form of bigotry that is, I think, increasing as we see more terror attacks. However, this is not to say that we shouldn't criticize the religion, and in fact, putting the criticism of the people and criticism of the religion all in one umbrella makes progress for them and for the broader society even more difficult, and it creates a extreme polarization where the only people that have, and I think Sam Harris has actually talked about this, where the only people that do talk about Islamic practices are the far right, the actual racists, the actual bigots, and we don't want that. We want to have a nuanced conversation, and we want to hold tight to our liberal values, even when there are certain religions that get in the way, and even when those beliefs are held by what could be a persecuted minority in other ways.
Okay. So Mohammed, we have Donald Trump, who's a very good example of that bigotry, saying let's build a 2,000-mile wall to keep out all the Mexican rapists. And we tend to gloss over that here because I think that's fairly transparent what he is. We also had the episode that just happened in Cologne, Germany, and I'd like you to talk about the liberal reaction or lack of reaction to that.
So personally, as a liberal, I want to help people. What's going on in Syria is appalling. We need to help the refugees. The issue is not looking at the situation realistically. When somebody from a different culture comes in, there's culture shock. You need to work to integrate people. And if you're bringing in 1 million people, you need to be very clear-eyed about what the consequences of that integration is, and have mechanisms in place. In Germany, they didn't do that. And on New Year's Eve, in Cologne, Germany, and in a bunch of different cities in Germany, in Finland, there were groups of men that attacked young women that were out for New Year's Eve. There were multiple rapes, multiple sexual harassment, and as a consequence of that, due to the fact that the left isn't addressing that, and even within the German media and the German police, they didn't address it for multiple days until it exploded on social media. The day after, the German police said that there were no notable incidents in the city. And what that does is it empowers xenophobic narratives like Donald Trump, because he's speaking about that even though he's coming at it from a xenophobic perspective. What Sarah's talk was talking about is that liberals need to stand up and be clear-eyed about that and look at it from a humanistic perspective. There are differences in culture. If we're bringing in people from different culture, we need to figure out what those differences are, how we can work on integrating these people and bring about the changes. So if you look at most Muslim countries, women are generally regarded as second-class citizens. In Saudi Arabia, which is the worst example, women aren't allowed to drive at all. I'm from Pakistan, and within Pakistan, sexual harassment is endemic. They even have days in shopping malls where men are not allowed because of that. In Egypt, when the revolution happened, in Tahrir Square, a CBS correspondent, Lara Logan, was attacked, and she wasn't the only one. In one single day, 80 women reported that they were attacked. And another activist from New York, Egyptian activist, Mona Al-Tahawi, was also attacked. So this is something that exists and is common within that culture. If we're bringing in people from that culture, we need to either work to re-educate them, reintegrate them, and when the left isn't willing to acknowledge that there is a problem, that there is a difference between these cultures that don't view women as highly as we do, and try to avoid that conversation, inevitably you'll have people like Trump, people will gravitate towards that.
Do you think that the left's failure is creating such a problem that right-wing governments are going to start taking over? People will be so fed up that things aren't being dealt with?
They already are. So in France, the far-right Le Pen's party, it had never won a significant percentage of the election. The last local elections, they won 30%, which was the highest of all parties. And that has never happened in the past. And if liberals don't stand up and defend liberal values and have clear-eyed conversations about this, I'm willing to bet this will happen everywhere.
All right. So, Andy, the next one is for you. We're going to go through a couple of different ways that you can think about religion. One of these is a book called The Religion Virus by Craig James. He talks about memes and memetics. Andy, you sent me this talismanic shirt. Can you explain this? And what do memes have to do with how we should think about religion?
Certainly. The term meme was actually coined by Richard Dawkins, and it's short for a Greek phrase, memes, which means to imitate. And the idea here is that memes are ideas, or fashions, or thoughts, or phrases, or music. They're a unit of cultural transmission of information. And just like genes, they can change, they can reproduce, they can spread. And the idea of memes is, I think, a useful way to think about religion, in the sense that religions are beliefs, they're man-made creations. And the way to think about them is that religions, the most effective religions, are ones that fit our cognitive anatomy. And I was trying to think of a way of illustrating this, and let me see. Get the right one here. One way of thinking about it is like gloves, okay? If we think of various aspects of our cognition, our cognitive anatomy, we have our attachment system, our attachment to caretakers. All of us are submissive to authority, much more than we would like to think. All of us have those theory of mind mechanisms that I was talking about. Right? Reading other people's minds. All of us have agency detection. We overread human agency. And all of the men in this room have a bias towards male coalitions and male coalitionary violence. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Right? Every man here has that. Okay? So if I build a religion that's going to be effective, I have to find something that is going to fit quite nicely on that on those mechanisms. And so if I had a glove that, I think this glove is kind of cumbersome. You know, it's got this mitten thing. It works, but it doesn't work very well, right? Whereas this glove, I think, is much better. It fits much tighter, it keeps my hand warm. So that's the way you want to think about religions and memes, that over time, religions change, but they change in a manner in which they fit the anatomy of our minds much tighter and much better. They both arise from and utilize these adaptations. And I thought this was an interesting illustration. This is called a talismanic shirt, and it's 500 years old, and it was worn under the armor of a warrior. And I think it illustrates it quite nicely. On this talismanic shirt, which probably took years to make, it's from India, and it's in cotton, written on that talismanic shirt is the entire Quran. The entire Quran. And there are a few of these shirts that exist, but this is one of the few that literally has the entire Quran written on it. And I think it illustrates what I'm saying. I mean, you want to think of our religious beliefs as fitting quite tightly on our cognitive anatomy, and here you have the Quran, in a sense, fitting quite tightly on a warrior's anatomy. And I think that's a nice way to think about religions, these complicated beliefs that arise from human minds, but that are finally honed to fit on the various mechanisms of our mind. And so when you see a powerful religion like Islam, Christianity, Judaism, you know that even if there are pieces of it that seem kind of strange, ultimately it fits very tightly on the anatomy of the human mind and the mechanisms.
I guess, can you also comment, does the meme serve the humans that follow the religion, or does it serve the religion's propagation itself? And maybe talk about how the intolerance meme might work, or proselytizing meme.
Sure. No, that's the other thing, is that people have tried to come up with, I think, good analogies. Memes are also like viruses. You want to think of these as mind viruses, because what does a virus do? A virus captures its host for the purpose not of helping the host, but of propagating the virus. I think this is the...
Right, you can jump into this. So this was the God virus and Darrell Ray and Bennett.
If you look on the left, you see an ant on the top of a flower. That ant doesn't belong there. That ant belongs in the ground. But what has happened is a lancet fluke on the right that you see pictured in the red, that microbe has infected that ant and taken over that ant's central nervous system. And it leads that ant to go to the top of the flower, where it's going to be eaten by sheep, and the lancet fluke, part of the reproductive cycle, is in the goat's or sheep's gastrointestinal system. And so, it's not for the benefit of the ant. The ant is going to die. It's for the benefit of that parasite, the lancet fluke. And you want to think of religions at times as parasites, as mind viruses. And I think we see this most tragically in the suicide, particularly the young suicide bombers, these kids who come to believe in jihad and martyrdom and place in paradise, and they really believe this stuff. I mean, they have stopped these young men at times and found their genitals are wrapped up in towels, and when they're interviewed, they say, they're protecting their genitals for the virgins in paradise. They really believe that they are going to die and be rewarded in heaven with eternal life and sort of an open-air bordello. But again, so they have a mind virus that is going to recruit other young men, that is great for the mind virus, but is deadly to the individual. So these are ways of conceptualizing the nature of religious belief.
So, Peter, this next question is for you. And on the PowerPoint here, we have this horseshoe that on one side lists the regressive left and on the other side the regressive right. And I think it came up in one of your recent podcasts as well. You've noted that one of the biggest impediments to progress is our growing inability to have honest conversations. Can you give us a short primer on classical conservatism and classical liberalism and compare that to where things stand now? And explain why is it so hard to have productive conversations?
Boy, I get the best questions and I get the questions that are most complicated at the same time. So I mentioned that on the Rubin report. We think of a political spectrum with the far left and the far right, and then in the middle there depends on culture, the United States and Britain, for example. So that's a French philosopher. That's not really a good way to think about it. Think about it as a horseshoe in which those ends are bent down. And when those ends are bent down, the far left and the far right are actually much closer to each other than they are to the center. And so I think we see that happening now with the coin that Sarah alluded to it. By the way, just parenthetically, if you haven't seen Sarah's talk, it is truly fantastic. It's one of the single best talks that I've seen on that subject in ever. It's fantastic. So anyway, so the idea is that the far left and the far right are closer to each other than they are to the center, and we see the way that they discharge these political impulses is through, again with the term coined by Majid Nawaz, regressive leftism. So classical liberalism, about which Sarah spoke eloquently in her talk, and then it's come up over and over again, and the values of free speech, free expression, and Mohammed mentioned the Cologne incident. We could spend 2 hours on that because I think it's a microcosm for what's going on. It's its own self-contained little universe about what's going on about race and gender and politics and the left's inability to speak clearly and frankly about these things. And I will just say this very quickly. Every time I bring this up or this comes up in conversation, the danger is that talking about these things makes you seem like you're on the right. I want to be absolutely crystal clear that I am not on the right, that I have never voted for a Republican president, and that I very much consider myself a classical liberal. And the idea, again, that Sarah said is correct, that if we don't have honest conversations about these things, then extremists will step in with the answers. And we see that with Trump and limiting Islamic immigration now. So we've lost the ability to be honest about our problems. We're not honest about problems of race. We're not honest about problems of gender. We're not honest about problems of religion. And the first thing you need to do to solve any problem is to be honest about it. But it's made worse because that incivility is coupled with the smear tactics, particularly on the regressive left. The right have their own set of institutionalized dysfunction. But you can't even have a conversation. Look what they've done to Sam Harris, for example, simply for wanting to have a conversation about complicated issues. And let's also be very clear about something. Moral issues are incredibly complicated. It takes a lot of intellectual labor to really think through the arguments and overcome the cultural myopia that we all have. We all think that the things that we do in our culture are true. And a lot of people think that they've latched on to these timeless, eternal truths about the nature of reality, when, to be blunt, they're just making stuff up. So we've lost our ability to have civil discourse about these things. And that, again, you can see that exemplified in that Bill Maher, Ben Affleck, Sam Harris clip. That really crystallized the whole problem, where you have a regressive leftist who's screaming and being angry, or not. Maybe as Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin have said, maybe they're not. Maybe he's just he's acting. I really don't know. But it's that anger, it's that mean-spiritedness, and it's that also the when someone wants to have a conversation about this, you smear those individuals. Well, every time we do that, it becomes more and more difficult to have conversations because fewer and fewer people are willing to speak openly and honestly about issues. And that, my friends, is the situation in which we currently find ourselves.
Exactly right.
So yeah, we still have a lot of material to go through. We do want to make sure we get some audience participation if you guys have questions. So maybe we'll do one more round right here. And Tad, if you could get a microphone, if you guys want to start thinking of questions, maybe we'll take a little, like a 5 or 10 minute break from what we're doing, let you guys ask some questions, and then get back and keep going through this. So, does anybody have one that they want to do right now?
This is a general question. Can any of the speakers, particularly the former Muslims, explain why the Islamic world, particularly in the Middle East and South Asia, is so sensitive to and hostile to any criticism of the Prophet or of apostasy?
When has any religion been receptive to criticism of the religion? The difference is in the West, they've been criticized for centuries, so they've become used to it. In the East, that hasn't happened. The few times people have criticized, they haven't survived the experience. So what we need to do is the same experience that happened in the West, where you had Thomas Paine, you had hundreds of Enlightenment thinkers and blasphemers that pushed the boundaries until it became the norm. That same thing needs to happen over there, and we need to support the people that are actually trying to change the dialogue over there.
And also, most of the Muslim countries, democracy is very hard to come by. I mean, usually the governments are more dictatorships or royalties. There's not widespread democracy in Muslim countries.
Well, it's not just democracy, right? I mean, democracy is good because you have the participation of the average person, but that could easily lead to a majority of Muslims that then say that those ex-Muslims need to go. But what I think is important is the protection of civil liberties, these things that we really take for granted: freedom of expression, freedom of speech. If I'm fundamentalist about anything, it's free speech, and I say that because it is a cornerstone of all of the liberties that we have here today, and why we're able to have the society that we have that can progress as far as it has come, because we have those guarantees that those dissenters, sometimes who the majority think are offensive, people have a protection, something protecting them. So I think it's democracy, but also the protection of the civil liberties that we have.
I would like to add to that in Pakistan, the idea of civil liberties doesn't really exist. Freedom of speech as a concept doesn't exist. Blasphemy laws are encoded within the constitution. There are also tyranny of the majority. Minority sects are actively persecuted by the consent of the majority. So one of the issues is that we presume that simply because a country has voted, they have democracy, but they don't understand the broader issues, the institutions that need to exist, and we're doing a very poor job of educating them on that.
Thank you. So I have a lot of friends who are kind of Chomsky-esque, I guess you could say, in their ideas about American foreign policy and our role that we played in, I guess, radicalization of groups in the Middle East. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. I don't know enough about recent history of American involvement in those areas to kind of fully understand the nuance behind that, but something seems wrong about the way it seems like they're laying blame for the problems of Islam on United States policy. I know we're not innocent, we're a government and we're, made mistakes, but what do you think about that? Anybody?
So with most things, there are multi-factor issues. So the American government has contributed to the problem, say, because of the Iraq War. It was generally viewed as an illegal war, and that radicalized people, and part of that is true, but that isn't the only. The United States is a relatively new country in comparison to world history, and these problems have existed way before the United States existed at all, before the West rose. Apostates were killed immediately after Muhammad's death, for example. The rise of Wahhabism, which is the super conservative version of Islam in Saudi Arabia, is from the late 1700s. And so these strains have existed long before the West came along and colonialism came along, and a lot of them themselves were imperialistic. So Turks conquered India, and there was religious oppression of the local minorities. 1380, was that a result of the West? Of course not. So to me, one of the issues with that whole narrative is it's denying agency to people from the East. They can't be bad, they can't make wrong choices unless the West prompts them to make bad choices. Everybody in the world is a fully realized person and can make good and bad choices, and there are consequences of those choices everywhere.
Peter, do you want to jump in anything on that about maybe radicalization, or you could even talk about de-radicalization?
Yeah, I think that we can talk about we could give a genealogical account of this, we can give some kind of chronology and try to explain it, but we're still faced with, and again, that's another thing that we're not willing to be honest about. What is the role of the American foreign policy in these issues? It seems to me to be a secondary, if not tertiary question, then what do we do about it right now? What kind of solutions can we take, and how do we address these problems? I don't really understand. Charles Murray said something very interesting, and I think it echoes Muhammad's comment, that there's this kind of inherent narcissism in the West in which we think every single thing in the world that happens has to do with us. And I think that that's rooted in the American psyche, and it's just not true. I remember hearing Rush Limbaugh blame Bill Clinton for Pakistan and in India when Bill Clinton wasn't even born yet. So I think that these problems, I think we'll gain less traction and less mileage from talking about historical relevance of the problem and more about what we should do now. What kind of actionable items should we take? And there are many things that people are talking about that are out there in public discourse. You know, the narrative, or what Sam Harris has recently called the narrative, profiling, should we do that? Gun control. I mean, there's just a basket of issues that we need to have honest conversations about. But in terms of the actual foreign policy issues, that's outside my area of expertise.
Andy, is there anything from Scott Atron maybe that you'd want to add in terms of how people get radicalized?
Well, no, I'd just to go back to your question, I think either Sam Harris or Majid Nawaz, I think, has a nice comment about that, which is, what does the West's invasion have to do with the sexual enslavement and rape of Yazidi women? That's coming from something else. So I think the left in this country is way off when they put the too much weight on American foreign policy. It's a kind of narcissism that I think we ought to dispense with. There are substantial problems in the Islamic world that the left doesn't, and in Islam, that the left doesn't want to acknowledge.
Is this working? Hello? So a question I had was, I go to school in Northern Virginia in a pretty diverse area, and I grew up around a lot of Paki and Afghan friends, and the sentiment that I get from them is that they don't feel like the religion is intrinsically violent or treats women as second-class citizens, and they're pretty happy with the environment of their religion. And I even met a Saudi student who she knew all the things that she's not allowed to do in Saudi Arabia, but she refused to say anything negative about the climate of how women are treated in Saudi Arabia. And I just wanted to know, if Islam produces all these negative things, why are people, unless they're lying to themselves, why do they feel positive about their Muslim upbringing? Why don't more women feel like you or feel like they're second-class citizens? What separates people from having sentiments that you have and others from feeling like, oh, my religion is positive and it doesn't do any of these bad things?
So if you had met me 10 years ago, I would have said the exact same thing. I was Muslim. I believed Islam was a humanistic, wonderful religion, and it was scientific, and I had lots of wonderful things to say about it. The issue was I hadn't explored Islam in detail. I hadn't looked into the history of it. I hadn't looked at what originally Islam was. So Muhammad himself, for example, instituted a lot of misogynistic laws that are integrated within Islam. Many Muslims may not even know that. Slavery, Muhammad himself traded slaves. The Arab slave trade had more victims than the Atlantic slave trade. Most Muslims will not acknowledge that or not talk about that. And due to the fact that we don't explore our history, we don't know enough about it, it's easier to deny that anything like that ever happened. So Raza Aslan, he was on multiple shows where he said that if you know anything about Islam, you know the first thing Muhammad did was ban slavery. Over 18 million people were enslaved by the Arab slave trade, millions in India alone. And he's able to say that with a straight face because of the fact that in most of the countries it's not taught. I grew up in Pakistan, we never talked about slavery, we never talked about the fact that Muhammad himself had sex slaves. So the parts of the hadith even have mention on how to rape your sex slave. So if you don't know about it and you only know the positive humanistic side of it, of course you're going to look at it positively the same way I did. But when you go through the text and look at what's actually written there, it's very hard to maintain that aura.
Yeah, I can talk about this as well. So my brothers are all Muslims. I come from a Muslim family. And as we were organizing this little panel, I had another email chain going with my brother and my sister-in-laws and some other friends. And it was about this exactly. I was pointing out, I mean, he was also bringing up geopolitics, and I was like, well, what is throwing gays off, rooftops in Iraq or Syria, and what does all of that have to do with, America or Israel or whatever? And of course, there was all this back and forth, and in the end, basically, he was saying, the problem is we have lost the sincerity or compassion that when Muhammad was, bringing religion at the time that they had, we don't have it, and so I understand why you feel this way. But the problem is, at that time, at Muhammad's deathbed, there were fights right then about who's going to be the caliph. So it's romanticized. And it wasn't ever that rosy. It was very real. I mean, there were fights. There was this clause of your right hand possess. People can have, sexual relations with their slave women. So it was, but I can speak of my family that they're really good people. They're, very moderate, and thankfully they haven't looked into all the negative sides of it, but they have this romanticized view of what it was like, and it's all in their head. I mean, if they looked further in detail, I think they would change their minds.
I think Andy had a response to that, and then we'll take one more question, and then we're going to get back to this so we can keep going, and then we'll take more questions at the end. So, Andy?
I think you want to keep in mind that an individual's religion is very tied up with their identity and the deep attachment system. So when you question somebody's religion, you're insulting their mother.
Oh, yeah.
At a deep level. And so I think you have to keep in mind that's part of it. So even if you see somebody who will acknowledge that, yeah, they can do things in the United States that they couldn't do in Saudi Arabia, yet will not question it, it's because they're not going to say something negative about in a psychological sense, they're not going to say something negative about their mother. They're deep attachments that are a core part of their identity.
To add a little bit to that, in the Muslim world, especially from Islamists, it's pushed that your primary identity is as a Muslim. And when we buy into that, we're doing a disservice to Muslims themselves because we're pushing them into that box. There's a wide variety of experiences, wide variety of cultures. The Pakistani culture, music, dance, food, everything is very different than Saudi, than Moroccan, than Indonesian. There are 1.6 billion people that are Muslim, but all of their experiences are different. If we highlight those differences, it'll make it much easier for people to identify the parts of their religion they don't identify with. So in Islam, music is generally regarded as extremely negative. We have beautiful music in Pakistan. Most Pakistanis adore their music. So if you sort of use that to point out the cognitive dissonance that they have, that you like this music, your religion says this music is bad, which do you prefer, your culture, your Pakistani culture, or your religion?
One thing about that Andy was saying, if you haven't read his book and you didn't hear his lecture a couple months ago, when he says that's like insulting your mother, you should read his book. It talks about fictive kinship, and religion really does play very specifically into that whole family bond. So it's very serious when he says that's the kind of insult. Last question.
I wanted to make a book recommendation for everyone. This book is available on Amazon, and it's also available in some of the local libraries. The title of the book is White Gold, the extraordinary story of Thomas Pellow and Islam's 1 million white slaves. What most white people don't understand is white people through history have been enslaved as other people have been enslaved. And they have been enslaved from Europe. So Muslims would come up into Europe and capture many different people from European countries, sometimes whole towns at a time, and take them back to Muslim countries and enslave them, and then they would become Muslim. And that's why some of the Middle Easterners you see have fully white European features, because they were taken, kidnapped from their European countries and brought to Muslim countries. But this is a very important book. It's a historical book, and it explains how slavery occurred in the white race as well as other races. I think part of the issue is white people feel invincible, and white people are treated as being invincible. We are not. We are just as capable of being enslaved as other races. We have been historically, and we need to guard against that. I do want to commend the ex-Muslims on stage. I know how brave you are. I have studied Islam. I understand. Thank you.
To add one thing to that, most Muslims don't talk about racism within Islam as well. We have price lists for slaves in the Muslim world, and Arab slaves were roughly 10 times more expensive than African slaves, and white slaves were roughly 10 times more expensive than Arab slaves.
Well, there's this process, right, of this liberalizing process where there are people within a community that dissent, that see the harm being done in whatever way, for human rights, for women's rights, whatever it is, and they speak out and they change that culture. And this has happened in Western countries, and it's happened for a long, long time. It hasn't been happening in some countries. There is a lot of lack of education about what the history was, and there's a lack of understanding about what certain practices do to people, and what they do to their human rights.
One other thing is that, to a certain extent, there were efforts late 1800s in South Asia, in the Middle East itself. But recently, over the past 50 or so years, with oil wealth, Saudi Arabia and Iran have been able to dominate the discourse. And therefore, the reformers that existed aren't well known, and their ideas have largely been squashed.
All right. If we can get back to this, Mohammed, can you give us, and you've already just covered some of this in the last few minutes, a little just basic history on Islam? I think you talked a little about the Sunni-Shia split, or Munaza had mentioned that. Talk about where religious authority comes from. And you also mentioned Saudi Arabia a little bit. Then Andy, after he does that, I'd like you to pick up after Saudi Arabia and Saeed.
So going back to Western perspectives, we often look at Western colonization, and the beginning of history is when the West showed up. But obviously things have been going on. Empires existed for a long time before that. After Muhammad arose, he conquered the rest of Arabia. Then his followers spilled out of Arabia. They conquered Egypt. They conquered all the way up to Spain. On the other side, all the way up to India. And in Muslim literature, if you read about that, the terms often used are liberated or opened the doors of Islam. So very, very Orwellian. And you can find this in textbooks in most Muslim countries. And as a result, they're not aware of the violence that was inflicted on their ancestors. So we talk about the Taliban, we talk about that part of the world and as being very conservative, very Islamic. But at a certain point, they were Hindu. And invasions happened and they were conquered, and hundreds of thousands of them were enslaved. And the average person in Pakistan wouldn't know that. Most of you may have heard of Marco Polo. There's a similar traveler in the 14th century on the Muslim side who wrote about the fact that the mountain range that separates India from Central Asia, the Hindu Kush, anecdotally people refer to it as the killer of Hindus because they had multiple raids all the time going into India, enslaving hundreds of thousands of people, bringing them across, and as a consequence they died, like during transit. So the history of the Arab world, the Muslim world, generally is no different than the Western world. When people gain power, they commit atrocities, they conquer other people, they plunder wealth. The difference is that we're viewing it as they're different, and Muslims want to view themselves as different as well, and we're enabling that. If you look at it as Muhammad was a warlord, he had certain actions that he did to gain power, and if you look at the archetype of warlords when they gain power, what they do to their opponents, how women are treated, harems are very common. Genghis Khan had harems, Muhammad had harems. There's nothing unique about that. We're, by buying into their narrative, making it unique. So I'm not sure what level of detail you were looking for.
Yeah, and can you also talk about where religious authority comes from?
So generally speaking, within Sunni Islam at least, or actually in Islam in general, the central text is the Quran, and the Hadiths are sayings of Muhammad, and those are regarded as central. You can't really doubt those and still be a Muslim. Which is why you see very few people willing to point out the flaws within the Quran, even though the Quran itself talks about black magic, talks about genies. But if you talk to the average Muslim, they will always acknowledge it as being perfect. So that's the core of Islam. After that, within a century or two, there were jurists that basically codified everything and made a larger law, which is regarded as Sharia, which is Islamic law. And since about the 9th century, that has largely been static, and people are still referring to that. And as a result of that, we have this stagnation where challenging any of the Islamic laws is regarded as heresy. There's actually a specific word for change, bid'ah, which is heretical. So the word itself has been stigmatized.
Well, just to add to that, another source of religious authority is the example of the Prophet, which is completely perfect. And that creates a lot of problems when you're talking about what real Islam is, and when you're looking at the actions of extremists or a state like ISIS, because there are quite a bit of what ISIS does was done in the time of Muhammad. It's then more difficult from a religious standpoint to say that this is immoral, which is why we need to seek out secular ways of calling something immoral.
That was actually going to be the next question for you is, what do you get when people start to say ISIS is not true Islam? And I guess you just answered some of them. Are they straying from history, or are they?
Well, I mean, they're not at all, and that's what's interesting about it, and that's what makes this a very difficult conversation. Just related to that in particular, there's a verse in the Quran which basically gives a husband the right to discipline his wife. I mean, he has to go through several steps. And then eventually, if she's still not listening, he can discipline her by beating her lightly, and that's I guess the current definition of
For what it's worth, lightly does not mention. Lightly
it's like, but that's what. Did I do that?
It's a sign.
Can I take that one, Rob, for a
Sure.
moment? So I find it fascinating that people who don't adhere to a doctrine tell us what the correct interpretation of that doctrine should be. And even people who do adhere to the doctrine, it's unclear to me how one knows what the correct interpretation of a book should be. And I think what has always fascinated me is when we and this is one of Andy's specialties, but when we find folks who have been radicalized and they leave suicide tapes, etc., they are very explicit in saying why they have killed themselves, and their motivations are explicitly religious. And yet we have people almost exclusively on the left denying those motivations. It is a very interesting phenomenon that I think bears some scrutiny. You know, al-Baghdadi and he has a PhD in Islamic studies. Evidently, I have no way to verify this, but he's memorized the whole Quran. And I think we need to have an honest conversation, which gets back to the earlier question is, look, I don't think there's any way to tell who is a real Muslim or a real Christian, because then you become a fundamentalist in terms of somebody else's interpretation of the text. The only thing that matters, in my judgment at this point, is that these people believe exactly what they say they believe. And we have a lot of people running around thinking that they don't believe what they say they believe. And I don't see how anybody could possibly have access to their minds when their verbal behavior and their actions comport with each other. So the only thing that matters is that these people who profess to believe this, we have to take them at their word, and they're willing to die for that. So I don't understand. It's a little bit of a mystery to me why, like, I understand why the President of the United States would say it, because he wants to create a kind of narrative in which ordinary Muslims don't feel excluded from the larger community and they themselves become radicalized. Like, I get that. But what I don't get is this impetus to say, look, these people, they have al-Baghdadi, even though he has a PhD in Islamic studies, memorized the Quran, he's made his whole life of this, wants to have a caliphate, is throwing gays out. They don't actually believe that. As my friend Faisal said, our mutual friend Faisal said, think of how frustrating that must be for those people. No matter what they do, everybody's constantly telling them they don't believe it. But I do think it's something that we need to scrutinize more carefully.
I have a bit of a problem with I understand why the president says things like Islam is a religion of peace. But it is still absolutely baffling to me that he becomes, and now this is happening all over the place, so now everybody is an expert on Quranic traditions and on Islam and on what it truly is. But this is not the conversation we need to be having. If he wants to draw compassion towards Muslim citizens, then you can do that without claiming in such a direct way about what a religion is or isn't, and making an ideological claim in that way, which is what he did when he says Islam is the religion of peace. And the reason I was talking about that verse earlier with about a husband being able to lightly beat his wife is that there have been countless feminists throughout history that have tried to interpret that verse in a slightly less misogynistic way. And it's a very difficult feat to accomplish when it says, in such explicit terms, that a husband has such rights over his wife. But people have been jumping through all sorts of hoops throughout history. There's so many feminist interpretations. I could write a book about it, about the embarrassment that some of them feel, and then they try to find a Quranic justification for women's rights. But we have to get over this concept completely about trying to justify human rights, women's rights, basic compassion and decency towards other individuals from the text. It doesn't have to come from the text. And we need to say that I don't care if your religion, your deepest held beliefs, say very explicitly and directly that you need to cut the throat of every redhead. You don't do that because we don't do that. And it doesn't matter what it says.
In a Western context, if you needed to justify freedom of speech through the Bible, if you needed to justify gay rights through the Bible, how hard would your journey be? And that is largely the box Muslims have pushed themselves into, and we need to help them get out of that. And the issue is when we don't criticize Islam, when we say that Islam is the religion of peace, when we don't point out that Muhammad was a 7th century warlord and acted that way, we make it easier for them to maintain that delusion. It's simply a conceit that Muhammad was a perfect man. As soon as you start looking at Muhammad's life, it's very clear that he was not perfect by far. So when Muslims are forced to acknowledge, be it wife beating, be it Muhammad's life, they'll have no choice but to liberalize, because most Muslims aren't on that page. Most Muslims aren't as violent as Muhammad was. I would say the vast majority of Muslims are better than Muhammad ever was.
So the next question is for Sarah, which is really something that Riza Aslan brings up. Actually, you wrote a whole piece when he appeared on CNN and talked about how women are liberated in Muslim countries or something to that effect. So when apologists point to Turkey as a proof that Islam can facilitate the advancement of women's rights and other laudable goals, what's wrong with their argument?
Well, it's Turkey in particular is an interesting example because it is, more secularized than many Muslim countries. I went there a couple of years ago, and I was actually shocked to see that there were people that were drinking. It seemed like almost a Western country. Of course, it has changed since then. But what's wrong about using Turkey as that example in particular is that Turkey was founded a hardline secularist, somebody who his name is Ataturk, and he was intent upon pushing separation of church and state, secularism within the Turkish people. And he instituted all sorts of measures to make that something, to make that a reality within his country. And this was by force sometimes. And it's suspected that he might have been an atheist himself. But he cared about secularism, and he despised certain aspects of the religion, and he made an effort to do it. And it wasn't something that just came out of nowhere. It was something that some person fought hard for and pushed very strongly, and even militarily in some cases.
There's a quote, I'm paraphrasing it, where Ataturk tried to stoke Turkish nationalism, and it was something along the lines of the Turkish nation was a great nation before the religion of the Arabs. So he specifically delineated Turks from Arabs and the Arab religion. And he said that the religion was sold to us that it would unite the Arabs, the Persians, and the Turks, and it has not done that. And even after the religion of the Arabs, the Turkish people will continue to be a great nation. So to use that as an example of Islam modernizing is dishonest.
Yeah, seems true for the golden age of Islam, as if Islam had anything to do with that. So Andy, the next question is for you, and trying to talk about Islamism, the faction of Islam that believes in political Islam. What can you tell us about Sayyid Qutb and his lasting effect on Sayyid Qutb? And his lasting effect on Islamism?
If you've not read it, I would recommend to everybody here they get the book Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright.
Yes.
It's about 9/11, but it is really about the rise of Islamism, Islamic fundamentalism. And the book starts off with a biography of Sayyid Qutb, and he was Egyptian, and he is, and I'll ultimately defer, you I think will probably know more about this than I. He was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he's the one that came up with such things as the justification for Muslims killing other Muslims. And he was such a radical influence, even at the time in Egypt, that he was sentenced to death and executed by Nasser. I mean, he was, and he's really the father, they think, the godfather, so to speak. And he was actually educated in part in the United States in the 1950s at Colorado State Teachers College. And he was appalled by the degree of women's liberation in the United States in the 1950s. But he's a fascinating individual, and I think worth knowing about. And his lawyer was Ayman al-Zawahiri's uncle. And there's a close relationship between Ayman al-Zawahiri and Qutb. And Qutb's brother, I think, was one of Osama bin Laden's teachers in Saudi Arabia. I think it's an extraordinary book, and I think my understanding, but many think that he is the intellectual godfather of the way that jihad has been interpreted in recent years. Am I?
Yeah, I would add the modern interpretation. So all of these things existed in the past, but he was the one that revived all of those practices. So Muslims killing Muslims exists from the beginning of Islam. The third and fourth caliph were murdered by other Muslims. So from the very beginning, the concept existed. But in modern times, Sayyid Qutb is responsible for spreading it.
The other line that I've heard recently, which I'd be curious, I actually have two questions for you all. One is that you hear that nothing that ISIS is doing these days wouldn't be approved of by the Prophet. One. And then my question, you alluded to 10 years ago you were an idealistic young Muslim, and that in recent meetings, I guess of Islamic associations, they're concerned about the youth being led astray. So my question is, what has allowed you all to move away in the modern world, and what can the secular community do to support whatever process, obviously in our view, liberated you and liberated what you were telling me earlier, the numerous members of your organization?
So it's the same forces that are acting in the West generally that are us pushing people away from religion. They have access to a lot more information, and the internet is one of the biggest things. For myself personally, one of the biggest things was Carl Sagan. I grew up in Pakistan. I never studied evolution. I understood evolution by reading Carl Sagan's work. For a lot of people, understanding science, understanding how the universe works, how we understand the universe, goes a long, long way. The other thing is they don't really encounter criticism of Islam. They don't encounter criticism of Muhammad. So whatever false narratives they're fed, they accept that. So if we challenge Islam vigorously, the same way we challenge Christianity, it will change things. So I'll ask Sarah to talk about this because the reason she left religion was she was challenged by a militant atheist.
Right. So this is why I have a soft spot in my heart for some of the more aggressive atheists, even when I find them irritating. Is that it was what I needed, because I had fooled myself into thinking that there was such a thing as a humanist Islam and that women were liberated by Islam, and it was something that I believed, and there was a lot about women's rights that is sort of fed to you about how Islam is wonderful for women. And I actually believed this growing up. I was sure of it, that this was a great religion for women, and it protects me and cherishes me in a way that no other religion does, or lack of religion. And so coming across some of these things was like a slap in the face. I mean, it felt literally like a slap in the face. But then it was only that me to think that I need to defend my religion against these unfair criticisms, and they have no basis in reality. And it was me running to the defense of the religion that was part of why I ended up leaving, because then I learned more about it than I ever could, and then I found that some of those criticisms they had a grain of truth. They were fair in some ways, and I ended up adopting those criticisms myself. So that was part of me leaving. Another thing that when I talk to secularists in general about how you can help is you don't have to, again, directly criticize their religion, but something like what Muhammad said, cosmos and general scientific principles, and sort of brushing them from the aspect of science and human rights is sometimes in itself effective. I mean, it might take a longer time, but it is effective in itself. I know a lot of people that have left purely because of those motives, and just learning about morality and sort of those kinds of things. So it's possible in that way too.
One of the biggest things that we've seen is taking philosophy lectures has caused people to leave religion.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, in my case, actually, it was the miracles of science. My dad had convinced me that there's the miracles in a Quran related to science. And actually, the textbook that we use in medical schools in Pakistan, embryology, has a verse of Quran on the first page of it. So I started reading Richard Carrier, who does a lot of historicity in Christianity and Islamic history, and he talks about whatever is in the Quran really matches with whatever they knew in that period. So that was my sort of.
Can I speak to that for one moment, Rob?
Yep.
So I think one of the themes, the emerging theme that we can pull out of that, is that we need to create conditions that allow people to sincerely inquire about questions. We need to create conditions that allow people to engage ideas. One condition that's not in place, we need free speech. We can't have blasphemy laws. And college campuses, now the big thing is safe spaces in which people are freed from engaging certain types of ideas, particularly if they have some emotional valence with religion. These things are an anathema to free thinking. And if we think about how the panelists, how they escaped, one of the ways they escaped is they were honest with themselves, they started asking questions, they started examining, but the conditions that we need in place for that are free inquiry, free expression, no safe spaces in terms of ideas, and we're moving away from that, and we're moving toward more sorts of blasphemy laws, both in the academy, in which those experiences, that's where most people take their philosophy courses, in the academy and in the wider society. So I think that's a good lesson for where we can move in terms of a practical import to deal with this problem.
All right, I'm going to say we're running low on time, so Munaz, maybe you can look forward. Let's find a few more questions that we want to try to get. If the speakers can all try to limit it to a minute or so we can run through a few things, and then we'll take some more questions from the audience at the end.
Actually, yeah, let's just ask...
I got one for Peter first, because I felt he was looking.
Okay.
Or do you have one on that last one still?
We wanted to just ask Sarah if you could differentiate between a moderate Christian and a moderate Muslim.
So that won't, it will take a minutes to talk about that. But
Barbecue.
I think what's important to understand is that I think it's just a mental shortcut that a lot of people take. And part of it is because we want to look at our Muslim neighbors and we want to think that they are good people. And here's the thing, they probably are. And believing bad ideas doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. And this is the harm that the trap that we fall into when we look and say, when we say that the moderate Muslims are against, let's say, persecution of apostates, when we make claims like that. Because the truth of the matter is that many Muslims, the majority of Muslims, do empathize with restrictions for apostates and with persecution for apostates. They do empathize, but that's not because they're bad people. It's because there are some bad ideologies that have had way too much hold for a very long time. And I think we want to talk about moderate Muslims and moderate Christians in that way because of this protectionism that we want to protect these Muslims from this criticism. But if we do that, we're actually putting them more in danger, because then people can look at those ideologies that they hold and think that they are just bad people. And that's why so many Muslims hold these bad ideas, because there's something inherently immoral about them, which is why we have to differentiate between the people and the ideologies.
So do you have any of those numbers offhand, just so the audience will get a sense of what percentage of Muslims think adulterers should be stoned to death, hands chopped off, like some of those?
Apostasy, I remember in Egypt, it's around 70% of people believe apostates should be killed. Globally, I think the number is closer to 30%.
It varies by region. It varies by the history of the various regions. In Southeast Asia is usually different than North Africa. So it's different, but we do see trends. It's not as if they are completely unrelated. And these are countries that you can't really point to much else that they have in common other than Islam. And when we talk about these trends and these correlations.
And we'll put up, Munaz had sent me an excellent link with the video that goes through some of those numbers. And on the Humanist website and mine, we'll put some stuff up that people can look at later. Peter, you've done a lot of work changing people's beliefs. Can you tell us about your doctoral research and then explain how that relates to atheos?
Sure. I went into the prisons here in Portland, and I developed interventions using the Socratic method, which was a way of asking questions. And I pulled from questions from the history of Western intellectual thought. And I tried to, and I say men because all of the men in my dissertation study, excuse me, all of the prisoners were men. And then I went into the prisons and I tried to change their cognition so that they were less likely to commit violent crimes. We have a word, it's called recidivism, that we don't really use very much anymore, but it basically means the number of people who go out and come back in and to prison. And we've substituted that for this idea of desistance, how people fare on desistance for crime. And the reason we've done that, it's not an esoteric point, it's a really important point that should be made bare for public policy, is because you could get out and commit crimes and just not get caught. So we wanted to help people desist in their journey to desistance, and particularly with violent crimes. So I went into the prisons and I conducted research using the Socratic method to help people desist from those behaviors. The same tools that I used in the prisons, I incorporated as different from different lines of literature. And then when I wrote a manual for creating atheists, I incorporated that literature into how to help people be more thoughtful and reflective about those beliefs. In my INR 5 talk, my Marginal Religion 5 talk, I talked about that specifically in relation to Islam and micro and macro strategies that we could use to help people desist from holding these beliefs. And then the app that we're coming out with does the same thing. It's how to use certain questions rooted in this Socratic method to help people become more reflective about their beliefs. Look, everybody knows that this stuff is problematic. And I see one thing that I think is really important is that we have to understand, I think Sarah was right, or Muhammad, I can't remember, who said that, but everybody is now an expert on the subject. The fact is that's just not true. People have very specific niche domains of expertise that we can bring to bear on the problem. What I think, one of the things that I think that we have to be very clear about is the difference, and again, this isn't just words, is the difference between Islam and Muslims, is the difference between a belief set and people. And for some reason, this differentiation seems to be too complicated for people. So I'm trying to think of a way to simplify it. Ideas are okay to criticize, people are not okay to criticize. Immutable, that's what I started my question off, was my conversation. Like, if you say the criticism of many Muslims and is that, well, you don't say the N-word. And my comment, my response to that would be, that's because it's an immutable property of a person. A religion is not an immutable property of a person. It's an idea, and thus you can subject that idea to scrutiny. So the same tools that we know that there's extensive lines of literature on how to change the cognitions and behavior of people who don't want their cognitions and behavior changed. I think we need to turn those tools from traditional arenas in which they've been applied to the problem of religious fundamentalism.
Mohammed, can you pick up, and again, we'll try to keep this short. You wrote a piece, you went on Fox News. They didn't seem very interested in actually educating themselves or their viewers. But can you tell us, you wrote a great piece about San Bernardino and how that related to you personally and your leaving Islam.
So the terrorist in San Bernardino, his brother has received multiple medals for counterterrorism. He was in the U.S. military. So there are two brothers. One attacked America, one defended America. And to me, that's very emblematic of what the actual issue is. The divide, often you have people, both on the left and on the right, that try to view it as a divide between the West and the East, which isn't what the actual issue is. You have people that are trying to build theocracies, people that are looking back, be it to the 1st century for Christians or the 7th century for Muslims, trying to go back to that mode set. And then you have people that are more rooted in secularism and human rights, and they exist in every single country, be it America, be it Pakistan, be it Saudi Arabia, and they're fighting back for those things. And we do a great disservice when we don't view it as secularists overall and don't ally ourselves with secularists overall. Within my own extended family, I'm an atheist. One of my cousins actually fought in Afghanistan on the other side. So, and we have a lot of people in our communities. Most of you may have heard that over the past year, multiple Bangladeshi bloggers were murdered for being atheists, for speaking out about secularism. One of the girls in our community who's also an atheist, her first cousin was involved in those murders and is on death row for that. So it's largely a fight within the community for where we are going towards the future. Some people want to pull back, some people want to move forward. So I would urge everybody to make sure that they're not viewing it as a West versus East, but it's progressivism, secularism, liberalism versus theocracy.
Andy, can you quickly say a few words, again, I guess mostly based on Scott Atron and Sam Harris too, what are popular misconceptions about suicide terrorists? What do people assume, if they're educated, wealthy, and then what's the reality, what does the data show?
Yeah, if you remember at 9/11, I think it was President Bush said something about crazy terrorists or something like that. And the research is that suicide terrorists are usually better educated, wealthier, emotionally healthier than age-matched controls. There's also an interesting phenomenon. There's high numbers, high rates of engineers, very educated engineers among suicide terrorists. So I think that tells us a couple things. That a lot of our biases are wrong. These are not disturbed, crazy individuals. And I think it also tells us just how powerful these beliefs can be. And that we want to try to, and to echo something Peter was just saying, we want to attract liberals back into the fold to question ideas. And my favorite recent one that I heard, I think, is either Sam Harris or Majid Nawaz. No idea is above questioning. No person is beneath dignity. That you rigorously question ideas and beliefs. You do not condemn individuals.
All right. I think I want to do one more, and then we're going to cut it. I don't know if we have time for.
Test.
Hello. I have I'm from Pakistan as well, and so I don't believe in Islam at all. But there are two things. One is a comment and one is a question. The comment I'll make really fast is that I think somebody asked over here that we blame problems on the West and all that. I think the majority of the problem right now, at least in Pakistan, is our own problems. I can see my family. They're all educated. They're all doctors and lawyers. And over the years, since I've been in this country for 23, 24 years, every time I go back, people are relatively less tolerant now. So I don't think so the education is working to build that tolerance. The problem in Pakistan, I feel, is that there is no liberal voices there. There used to be parties which is, on the left ideology, like People's Party in Pakistan. Some people probably know Benazir Bhutto. But now those parties are like all corrupt and they have no ideologies left, right? So there was a socialist movements or the leftist movements when we were going to school and colleges. But those parties are gone, those voices are gone. And that's the sad situation, and that is the thing which worries me most, because you see all the time like the journalists who speak, doesn't matter about the religion, even they speak anything about the military or something, they get killed. So the liberal voice is a big issue. But I have a question for the entire panel about, somebody says that, okay, we are not against the people, we are against the ideas. But what do you do when the ideas are in the people who are on these authoritarian positions, and they control your school systems, or they control how the swimming pool environment should be for the girls and the boys, and things like that, So how do you, I know that I will accept anybody, and I think we as a liberal need to accept the most conservative people the most. And I understand that we should not label people and all that. But these ideas are sitting in some people who are in extremely powerful positions. And how do you deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah. So one of the things is that we sort of want a quick fix. And that's generally not the case. If you look at the West, it took centuries for the West to move from where it was in, say, the 15th century to women's rights, to suffrage, to ending slavery. This same sort of process has never happened. So we need to be focusing on the basics, in my opinion. We won't be able to change it overnight. We need to focus on the basics. We have more and more people that buy into liberal ideas, and we need to educate them on why these ideas are actually better. We talk about the marketplace of ideas, where we have all ideas out there, and may the best idea win. But we need to put those ideas out there and challenge the ideas that they have. So over time, maybe 10 years, maybe 100 years, when you have a good amount of people that have started to buy into these ideas, they will be the ones that will change the narratives within those countries.
Okay. Are we getting okay. We have lots more, but I think we really need to respect the people that have come and helped us out today, and the speakers for juggling their schedules. Thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate you staying for the whole thing.
Thanks for putting it together, Rob. And it's finally, it was a really interesting discussion. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Thank all of you guys for coming.
Thank you.